There's nothing quite like the sting of your own family laughing at your misfortune. When Caleb Monroe inherited a crumbling warehouse, his relatives couldn't hide their amusement. Was the family failure getting exactly what he deserved? Caleb was a single father of two who just lost his job at the auto shop. His family saw him as the one who couldn't make anything work. The warehouse looked worthless: boarded windows, broken loading docks, weeds everywhere. His brother called it Caleb's concrete coffin. Most people would have walked away. But sometimes what looks like your worst moment becomes your greatest opportunity. What would you do if your family's biggest joke became the key to everything you'd ever dreamed of? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the kitchen window of Caleb Monroe's rented duplex, each drop like a reminder of bills he couldn't pay. Steam rose from his coffee mug as he sat at the scarred wooden table, watching his 17-year-old daughter Evie pack her lunch with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned not to expect much. Across from her, his 14-year-old son Marcus hunched over a bowl of generic cereal, his dark hair falling across eyes that held too much understanding for his age. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson asked about the rent again yesterday," Evie said quietly, not looking up from her sandwich. She had her mother's gentle way of delivering hard truths, wrapping them in softness that somehow made them cut deeper. Caleb's hands tightened around the warm ceramic, 3 months behind now, and Henderson's patience was wearing thin. The severance from Murphy's Auto had lasted exactly 6 weeks, long enough to fool himself into thinking he could find something else, something better. But in this economy, skilled mechanics were a dime a dozen, and at 42, he wasn't the young man who could work 20-hour days anymore. "I know, sweetheart. I'm handling it." Marcus snorted without looking up. "Like you handled the electric bill?" The words stung because they were fair. Last week, they'd eaten dinner by candlelight, and it wasn't romantic, it was humiliating. Caleb had told the kids it was an adventure, but Marcus was too old for those games now, and Evie was too kind to call him on the lie. "Marcus," Evie warned, shooting her brother a look. "What?" "We're all thinking it." Marcus finally lifted his head, and Caleb saw his own stubborn jawline reflected in his son's face. "Mom's been gone 3 years, Dad. 3 years of you promising things were gonna get better, and look where we are." The mention of Sarah hit like it always did, a sucker punch to the solar plexus. She hadn't chosen to leave them, but cancer didn't care about timing or fairness or the 2 children who still needed their mother. The medical bills had cleaned out their savings, the funeral had finished off the college funds, and the grief had made Caleb sloppy at work just when he needed to be sharp. "Your mother would want us to face reality," Marcus interrupted. "She always said that. Remember, face reality with your chin up, Monroe boys." Evie reached across the table and squeezed Caleb's weathered hand. "We know you're trying, Dad. Marcus knows it too." Her faith in him was almost worse than Marcus's anger. At least anger was honest. Faith required him to keep disappointing people who deserved better. The phone rang, cutting through the tension. Caleb glanced at the caller ID and felt his stomach drop. Williamson, Pike, Associates, his brother Derek's law firm. "Yeah?" "Caleb." Derek's voice carried that particular tone of professional courtesy, masking personal disdain. "We need to discuss Uncle Thomas's estate. The reading is tomorrow at 2. Uncle Thomas. Caleb barely remembered the manor shadow figure from childhood who disappeared from family gatherings before Caleb hit double digits. The official story was that Thomas had gone eccentric and moved away. The whispered version, overheard at Thanksgiving tables, suggested mental illness, failed business ventures, and the kind of shame that made families pretend people had never existed. "I thought there wasn't much to discuss. Dad always said Thomas died broke. There's a property, industrial, not worth much, but it needs to be dealt with." Derek's pause carried weight. "Look, Cal, I know things are tight for you right now." Mom mentioned the job situation. Of course she had. Helen Monroe never met a family failure she couldn't dissect over Bridge Club coffee. The property comes with some debt, but if you're not interested in taking it on, we can work something out. Maybe Frank or I can handle the disposal. Frank, Derek's younger brother, the successful one who'd parlayed an engineering degree into a consulting firm that bid on city contracts. Frank, who drove a BMW and lived in the subdivision with the golf course. Frank, who'd somehow avoided mentioning Caleb's existence to his clients when they ran into each other at the hardware store. What kind of property? Warehouse. Industrial district on the east side. Thomas owned it outright, apparently, though God knows how he afforded it. Built in the 60s, been empty for years. The city's been after someone to either fix it up or tear it down. Caleb felt something stir in his chest, not hope, exactly, but curiosity. A warehouse meant space. Space meant possibilities, even if he couldn't name them yet. I'll be there tomorrow. Cal, listen. Don't get your hopes up. The place is a wreck. The neighborhood's gone to hell, and the property taxes are behind. This isn't some windfall. I said I'll be there. After he hung up, the kitchen fell quiet except for the rain and the soft scrape of Evie's spoon against her cereal bowl. Who was that? She asked. Uncle Derek. Apparently your great-uncle Thomas left us something. The crazy one? Marcus perked up, his earlier sullenness replaced by interest. He wasn't crazy, Caleb said automatically, though he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to defend a man he barely knew. Just private. What did he leave us? Evie leaned forward, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to believe in treasure maps and hidden fortunes. A warehouse. Like a big building? Marcus's eyes widened. Apparently. Don't get excited. Your Uncle Derek made it sound like more trouble than it's worth. But even as he said it, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the faint flutter of possibility. A warehouse, industrial space. He'd always been good with his hands, good at fixing things, building things. Maybe there was something there, some way to turn space into opportunity. The next day, the law office of Williamson, Pike, Associates occupied half a floor of the city's second tallest building. Derek's secretary, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, ushered Caleb into a conference room where his family was already assembled. Helen Monroe sat at the head of the polished table like a queen holding court. At 73, she still commanded rooms through sheer force of will and the kind of steely disappointment that could make grown men feel like scolded children. To her right sat Frank, checking his phone with the casual arrogance of someone whose time was always more important than the occasion. Derek occupied the power position behind a stack of legal documents, his expression carefully neutral. Caleb. Helen's nod was economical. You look thin. Hello, Mom. Frank glanced up from his phone long enough to offer a brief wave. Cal, how are things? Fine. The lie came easily. Kids are good. Glad to hear it. Frank was already looking back at his screen. Derek cleared his throat and opened the top folder. This shouldn't take long. Thomas died intestate, which complicated things, but we've established clear lineage. The estate consists primarily of real property, a warehouse at 1247 Industrial Boulevard, along with the land it sits on. He slid a photograph across the table. The building looked like something from a post-apocalyptic movie, a long, low concrete structure with boarded windows and weeds growing through cracks in the loading dock. The parking lot was a moonscape of potholes, and someone had spray-painted "Condemned" across one wall in dripping red letters. Jesus, Frank muttered. That's what passes for an inheritance these days. The property is free and clear, Derek continued, but there are outstanding municipal fines for code violations and unpaid property taxes dating back 18 months. Total owed to the city is approximately $47,000. Helen sniffed. Who's responsible for that debt? Whoever accepts the inheritance, which is why I wanted to discuss options. The building would need substantial work to be habitable or rentable, and given the neighborhood— What neighborhood is it? Caleb interrupted. Derek consulted his notes. East Industrial District, near the old railway yards. It's not what you'd call a growth area. Caleb knew that area. During better times, he'd driven through it on his way to jobs at the shipping companies that used to operate there. Before the economy tanked and the freight traffic moved to newer facilities on the other side of the city, now it was mostly empty lots, abandoned buildings, and the kind of businesses that didn't need foot traffic. The sensible thing, Helen said, her voice carrying the weight of maternal authority, would be to disclaim the inheritance. Let the city deal with it. Or, Frank added, not looking up from his phone, we could see if there's any scrap value in the building materials. Might cover the demolition costs. That's not necessary, Caleb said quietly. The room went still. Derek's pen stopped moving across his legal pad. Frank actually looked up from his phone. Helen's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. I'm sorry, she said. I said that's not necessary. I'll take it. Frank laughed not meanly, but with the kind of disbelief reserved for truly absurd statements. Cal, you can't afford rent on a duplex. How are you going to handle $47,000 in municipal debt? I'll figure it out. Caleb, Derek's lawyer voice kicked in, smooth and reasonable. I understand the appeal of property ownership, but this isn't a house in the suburbs. This is a commercial property in a declining area with significant financial obligations. The responsible thing is for me to make my own decisions about my inheritance. Helen's voice could have flash-frozen coffee. Your inheritance. This is some kind of family obligation, not a gift. None of us even spoke to Thomas for 20 years. Maybe that was the problem. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Caleb hadn't meant to say them, hadn't even known he was thinking them, but once they were out, he felt a strange sense of rightness. What's that supposed to mean? Frank's phone was forgotten now. Caleb looked at the photograph again. The building was ugly, sure, but it was also big, solid. It had good bones, as Sarah used to say about old houses they'd drive past, dreaming of projects they couldn't afford. Maybe Thomas left this to me for a reason. Thomas left it to you because you were the only one stupid enough to take it, Helen snapped. The insult landed clean, but instead of the usual shame, Caleb felt something else, kind of stubborn clarity. His mother was probably right. This was probably stupid. But stupid was better than nothing, and nothing was all he had left to lose. Then I guess I'm stupid. He looked at Derek. What do I need to sign? Derek sighed and reached for another folder. I'll need about an hour to prepare the documents. Are you sure about this, Cal? Once you sign, those debts become your responsibility. I'm sure. As Derek gathered his papers, Frank shook his head. This is insane, Cal. You're taking on massive debt for a building that's probably not even structurally sound. Frank's right, Helen added. This is just like you're rushing into something without thinking it through. But Caleb wasn't listening anymore. He was studying the photograph, seeing past the decay and neglect to the possibilities underneath. 40,000 square feet of space, loading docks, high ceilings. Room to build something, fix something, create something. Room to start over. An hour later, he walked out of the law office with a deed in his pocket and a set of old brass keys that felt warm in his palm. Great Uncle Thomas's keys, the artifact that would unlock more than just doors, but possibilities he couldn't yet imagine. Behind him, he could hear Frank talking to their mother about intervention strategies and financial counseling. But for the first time in months, Caleb Monroe was smiling. Sometimes the best decisions were the ones everyone else thought were crazy. The warehouse looked worse in person than it had in the photograph. Caleb stood in the cracked parking lot with Evie and Marcus, watching pigeons scatter from the broken windows as a freight train rumbled past on tracks that had seen better decades. The building stretched before them like a sleeping giant, its concrete walls stained with rust and tagged with graffiti that spoke of dreams deferred and territories claimed. "Dad," Marcus said slowly, "please tell me we're not actually going to live in there." The duplex had been lost 3 days after Caleb signed the inheritance papers. Mrs. Henderson had been apologetic, but firm 5 months of back rent was 5 months too many, and her own mortgage wouldn't pay itself. The kids had packed their belongings into garbage bags and cardboard boxes, the accumulated treasures of their short lives, reduced to whatever could fit in the back of Caleb's pickup truck. "It's temporary," Caleb said. though the word felt hollow even to him. Just until I get back on my feet. Evie walked toward the main entrance, her sneakers crunching on broken glass. The steel door hung askew on rusted hinges, and someone had spray-painted "Abandon Hope" across it in black letters. She pushed it open with a squeal of protest from the metal. "The electricity's been shut off for 2 years," Caleb called after her. "Be careful in there." The interior was a cavern of shadows and dust motes, dancing in shafts of light that leaked through cracks in the boarded windows. Their footsteps echoed in the vast space, bouncing off concrete walls and disappearing into the darkness above. The ceiling stretched 30 feet overhead, supported by massive steel beams that looked solid enough to hold up the world. "It's actually kind of cool," Evie said, her voice carrying that forced optimism she'd perfected since her mother's death. "Like a cave or a castle." Marcus kicked at a pile of debris. "A really crappy castle." But Caleb was already seeing it differently. The space was enormous, big enough for a workshop, storage, maybe even apartments if he could ever afford the renovations. The loading docks were functional, and the concrete floors, though cracked, were level. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. They spent the afternoon setting up a makeshift living space in the southwest corner, where a bank of windows faced away from the main road. Caleb strung up a tarp to create privacy, and they arranged their few pieces of furniture, 2 beds, a card table, and 3 folding chairs, into something that resembled a home if you squinted in the right light. That night, they ate cold sandwiches by the light of battery-powered lanterns, while the building settled around them with creaks and sighs that spoke of decades of neglect. The autumn wind found every gap in the walls, creating a symphony of whistles and moans that made sleep difficult for everyone. "This is insane," Derek had said when Caleb called to tell him about the move. "You're living in a condemned building with your children. Child services could what? Take them away and put them in foster care. At least here we're together." But lying on his cot in the darkness, listening to his daughter's quiet breathing and his son's restless tossing, Caleb wondered if Derek might be right. This wasn't stability. This was desperation dressed up as determination. The first week was an exercise in creative problem-solving. They used the gas station across the street for bathroom facilities and bottled water for drinking and washing. Caleb had managed to get the gas line connected, so they had heat from a small space heater, but the electrical system would require a complete overhaul before the city would restore power. The neighbors were a mixed bag of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Chen, who ran the Chinese restaurant 2 blocks away, started sending them leftovers after Evie helped her carry groceries one afternoon. Roberto, the mechanic who operated out of a garage across the street, offered to let them use his shop's bathroom during business hours. But there were others, the kind of people who gathered in empty lots after dark and made Marcus nervous when he walked to the convenience store. "How long are we really going to live like this?" Marcus asked one morning, his breath visible in the cold air. October was giving way to November, and the warehouse's concrete walls held the chill like a refrigerator. "I'm working on it," Caleb said, though working on it mostly meant filling out job applications at every auto shop, factory, and repair service within a 50-mile radius. His savings, what little remained after the duplex disaster, were disappearing with brutal efficiency. That's when Evie made her discovery. She'd been exploring while Caleb was out job hunting, and Marcus was at school. The warehouse was full of forgotten corners and mysterious spaces, areas where decades of different tenants had left their marks. Most of it was junk, broken pallets, rusted machinery, piles of paper documents too faded to read. But in the northeast corner, behind a stack of old vending machines that looked like they hadn't worked since the Carter administration, she found something odd. "Dad, you need to see this." Caleb followed her through the maze of debris, past shelving units that held nothing but dust and the desiccated remains of what might once have been office supplies. The vending machines were arranged in a rough semicircle, their glass fronts cracked and their coin slots rusted shut. "Look at this," Evie said, pointing to the wall behind them. At first, Caleb saw nothing unusual, just the same concrete wall that formed the rest of the building. But as Evie directed his flashlight beam, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The wall didn't quite match. The concrete was a slightly different color, and there was a hairline crack that ran vertically for about 6 feet. "It's a door," Evie said. "Look." She was right. Hidden behind decades of grime and careful camouflage was the outline of a door. And there, at about waist height, was a handly, small metal lever painted the same color as the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The hidden door handle, the artifact that would change everything. Caleb's heart hammered as he reached for it. The lever moved with surprising ease, and there was a soft click from somewhere inside the wall. A section of concrete swung inward on silent hinges, revealing darkness beyond. "Holy crap," Marcus breathed. He'd appeared behind them without either noticing. "Language," Caleb said automatically, but his attention was fixed on the opening. Cool air drifted out, carrying scents of metal and oil and something else, something that reminded him of his grandfather's workshop. "What's in there?" Evie whispered. Caleb shone his flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed a space that extended further than the light could reach. He could see workbenches, equipment covered in tarps, and walls lined with what looked like blueprints or technical drawings. "I don't know," he said, but his voice carried a tremor of excitement that he hadn't felt in years. "But I think we're about to find out." They stood at the threshold of the hidden room, 3 people who'd lost everything they thought mattered, staring into a darkness that might hold answers to questions they hadn't known to ask. Behind them lay the wreckage of their old life. Ahead lay possibilities that Great-Uncle Thomas had kept secret for decades. Caleb took a deep breath and stepped through the doorway into the unknown. The hidden room was larger than the opening had suggested, maybe 20 feet by 30, with a ceiling that matched the height of the main warehouse. But where the warehouse was empty and echoing, this space was full. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces covered with cloth tarps that had protected whatever lay beneath from decades of dust and neglect. "It's like a laboratory," Evie said, her voice hushed with wonder. That's exactly what it was like, Caleb realized. The kind of workshop where serious work got done by someone who understood precision and craftsmanship. The concrete floor was painted a clean white, now yellowed with age, and there were power outlets and compressed air lines running along the wall's infrastructure that spoke of sophisticated equipment and careful planning. Marcus had found a light switch and was flipping it experimentally. No power. "The electrical system was probably connected to the main building," Caleb said. "But we can use flashlights for now." They moved through the space like archaeologists, lifting tarps and peering into corners. Under the first tarp was a drill press that looked like something from a machine shop-heavy, precise, and well-maintained despite its age. The second revealed a lathe, and the third a milling machine that must have cost more than Caleb's truck when it was new. "Who was this guy?" Marcus asked, running his hand along the smooth metal of the lathe bed. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, but he knew what he was doing. The walls were covered with technical drawings, blueprints, and what looked like patent application tool, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves and organized with the methodical precision of an engineer. Caleb recognized some of the symbols and measurements from his own technical training, but the complexity of the designs was far beyond anything he'd encountered in automotive repair. This wasn't just a workshop. This was where someone had been inventing things, creating things, building things that mattered. And somehow, it was all his now. As they explored deeper into the room, Caleb felt a strange sense of connection to the uncle he'd never really known. Thomas Monroe might have been the family eccentric, the relative nobody talked about, but he'd built something remarkable here, something that suggested a brilliant mind and decades of dedicated work. The question was, what had he been working on? And why had he hidden it away from the world? Standing in that secret workshop, surrounded by the tools and dreams of a man he was only beginning to understand, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the spark of genuine hope. This wasn't just shelter. This wasn't just space. This was possibility made manifest. And for the first time since inheriting the warehouse, he began to think that maybe Great-Uncle Thomas had known exactly what he was doing when he left it all to the family failure. Maybe being the failure was exactly what qualified him to understand what he'd found. The blueprints were like nothing Caleb had ever seen. He spread them across the largest workbench in Thomas's hidden workshop, weighing down the corners with vintage calipers and micrometers that felt substantial in his hands. The paper was yellowed with age but preserved with obsessive care, each sheet protected in clear plastic sleeves and labeled with Thomas's meticulous handwriting. "Machine Assembly A7, he read aloud, adjusting his flashlight to better illuminate the detailed drawings. Prototype Series, Classification, Level 3. Classification, Level 3. That sounded official, maybe even governmental. What had Thomas been involved in that required security classifications? Evie leaned over his shoulder, studying the intricate diagrams with the focused intensity she usually reserved for her advanced mathematics homework. "It looks like some kind of precision manufacturing equipment. See these tolerances?" She pointed to a series of measurements marked in thousandths of inches. "Whatever this makes has to be incredibly accurate." Marcus had found a stack of bound notebooks and was flipping through pages covered with calculations, sketches, and what looked like test results. "Dad, some of this stuff is dated from the 1970s. Uncle Thomas was working on this for decades." The scope of what they discovered was becoming clearer with each document they examined. This wasn't just a hobby workshop or even a professional machine shop. This was a research and development operation that had been running in secret for at least 30 years. "Look at this," Evie said, pulling another blueprint from the stack. This one showed a device that looked like a cross between a microscope and a drill press, with control systems that seemed far too sophisticated for the era when it was designed. "The patent application is dated 1979, but look at the electronic components. This is way ahead of its time." Caleb studied the drawing, his mechanical training helping him understand the basic function, even if the overall purpose remained mysterious. The device was designed to manipulate materials at incredibly small scales, with feedback systems that could make adjustments measured in millionths of an inch. "This is nanotechnology," he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Or at least a primitive version of it. In 1979, this would have been science fiction." "So why didn't anyone know about it?" Marcus asked. "I mean, if Uncle Thomas invented stuff that was 30 years ahead of its time, wouldn't he be famous? Rich?" That was the question that had been nagging at Caleb since they'd first entered the workshop. The equipment here represented millions of dollars in development costs, and the intellectual property value could be astronomical if the patents were still valid. So why had Thomas lived like a hermit, avoiding his family and working in secret? The answer came from an unexpected saucer manila envelope tucked between two of the bound notebooks, labeled simply "Personal" in Thomas's careful script. Inside were letters, dozens of them, spanning decades, most on official letterhead from companies and government agencies that Caleb recognized as major players in defense contracting and advanced manufacturing. The first letter, dated 1976, was from a company called Meridian Industries. "Mr. Monroe," it read, "we remain very interested in acquiring the rights to your precision manufacturing process. Our offer of $2.3 million for complete patent assignment stands, with additional royalty considerations for future developments. We believe your work could revolutionize several industries, and we're prepared to provide you with unlimited research funding and state-of-the-art facilities." $2.3 million in 1976 money. Caleb did quick math in his head. That would be worth at least $10 million today, maybe more. The second letter, from the same company 6 months later, was more insistent. The third, increasingly aggressive. By 1978, the tone had shifted from encouragement to barely veiled threats about patent challenges and legal action. "He turned them down," Evie said, reading over Caleb's shoulder. "All of them. Look at this one from 1981. This letter was from a different company, Techdyne Corporation, and it was more direct than the others. "Mr. Monroe, We understand your reluctance to license your technology for military applications, but you must understand that your innovations have national security implications. Continued refusal to cooperate may result in involuntary patent acquisition under the Defense Production Act. Involuntary patent acquisition. They were threatening to simply take his work. Jesus, Marcus whispered. They were trying to steal his stuff. The pattern became clear as they read through more letters. Thomas had invented something revolutionary, something that could change manufacturing, possibly warfare, and every major corporation and government agency wanted it. But Thomas had refused to cooperate, choosing instead to hide his work and himself. But why? Evie asked. I mean, if he could have made millions, lived comfortably, why hide? The answer was in the last letter in the stack, dated 1983. This one was handwritten on personal stationery from someone named Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Tom, it began, using the familiar form of his name, I understand why you won't trust the corporations, and I don't blame you for avoiding the military contracts. But your work is too important to die with you. Have you considered donating your patents to a university? MIT or Caltech would protect your legacy while ensuring the technology is used responsibly. Please think about it. The world needs what you've created, but it needs it to be used wisely. At the bottom of the letter, in Thomas's handwriting, was a single word: someday. He was planning to do something with it, Caleb said, pieces clicking together in his mind. But he wanted to make sure it went to the right person, someone who would use it responsibly. Someone like you, Evie said quietly. The thought was overwhelming. Caleb Monroe, failed mechanic and family disappointment, inheritor of technology that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was like winning the lottery, except the ticket came with a responsibility that felt heavier than the reward. We need to understand what we're dealing with, he said, forcing himself to think practically. These patents, if they're still valid, if the technology still works, this could change everything for us. Could change everything for a lot of people, Marcus added, holding up another blueprint. This one showed a medical device, something that looked like it could perform surgery at the cellular level. As they continued exploring the workshop, the magnitude of Thomas's achievement became increasingly apparent. This wasn't just one invention, it was an entire suite of related technologies, all based on precision manufacturing principles that were still cutting edge today. There were prototypes too, covered machines that hummed with potential energy, even in their dormant state. Caleb found himself afraid to lift the tarps, afraid of what he might find underneath. Each discovery felt like opening a door to possibilities that were both thrilling and terrifying. Dad, Evie said, her voice carrying a note of concern that made him look up from the patent documents. What are we going to do? I mean, if this stuff is really as valuable as it looks, people are going to find out eventually. She was right, of course. Secrets this big had a way of surfacing, especially when money was involved. And if the letters were any indication, there were powerful people who would stop at nothing to get their hands on Thomas's work. We're going to be smart about it, Caleb said, though he wasn't sure what being smart looked like in this situation. First, we need to understand exactly what we have. Then we need to figure out how to protect it. Protect it from who? Marcus asked. That was the question that would keep Caleb awake that night, staring at the ceiling of their makeshift living space while his children slept nearby. The letters had made it clear that Thomas's work had attracted attention from some very serious people corporations, government agencies, individuals who viewed innovation as something to be controlled rather than celebrated. And now that work belonged to a broke mechanic who couldn't even afford to pay his rent. But as he lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city beyond the warehouse walls, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just hope that was too simple. This was purpose, the sense that maybe his life had been leading him to this moment all along. Thomas had chosen him for a reason, the family failure, the one who couldn't make anything stick, the one who understood what it meant to be dismissed and underestimated. Maybe that made him exactly the right person to carry forward the work of a man who had valued wisdom over wealth, principle over profit. The engineer's blueprint spread across the workbench represented more than just technical innovation. They were a testament to one man's refusal to compromise his values, even when it meant sacrificing fortune and recognition. And now they were Caleb's responsibility. Tomorrow, he would begin the real work of understanding what Thomas had built. Tonight, he would dream of possibilities that seemed both wonderful and dangerous, knowing that his life had just become infinitely more complicated, but also, for the first time in years, infinitely more meaningful. The patent application draft that Evie found buried in Thomas's filing system changed everything. Unlike the completed patents they'd discovered earlier, this document was unfinished, marked with revision notes and question marks in Thomas's careful handwriting. But what made Caleb's hands shake as he read it was the date December 1985 and the estimated value notation written in the margin, 180M minimum licensing potential, $180 million. The number seemed to float above the page like a mirage, too large to fully comprehend. "This can't be right," Marcus said, peering over his father's shoulder at the document. "I mean, that's more money than some countries have." But as Caleb studied the technical specifications, his automotive training helping him understand the mechanical principles, even if the applications were beyond his experience, he began to see why Thomas had written that number. This wasn't just an improvement on existing technology, it was a fundamental breakthrough that could revolutionize manufacturing across dozens of industries. The draft described a precision control system that could coordinate multiple manufacturing processes simultaneously, adjusting for variables in real time, with an accuracy that was still considered cutting edge today. In 1985, it would have been like having a smartphone in a world of rotary phones. "Look at this section," Evie said, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom of the page. "It talks about medical applications, aerospace manufacturing, even computer chip production. This one invention could improve everything." The implications were staggering. If Thomas's estimates were accurate and the meticulous research they'd seen so far suggested he wasn't given to exaggeration, then Caleb was sitting on intellectual property that could set his family up for generations. But the draft also revealed why Thomas had never filed it. At the bottom of the page, in red ink, he'd written a single word: consequences. He was scared, Caleb realized aloud. Not of the technology, but of what people would do with it. The letters they'd found the day before suddenly made more sense. Thomas hadn't just been hiding from corporate pressure, he'd been protecting something that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in multiple industries. In the wrong hands, technology, this revolutionary could be used to dominate markets, eliminate competitors, even influence national policy. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. "I mean, we can't just pretend we didn't find this." That was the question that had been consuming Caleb's thoughts since they'd first entered the hidden workshop. They were living in a warehouse, struggling to pay basic bills while sitting on technology that could solve their financial problems forever. But the moral complexity of the situation was becoming clearer with each document they uncovered. A knock on the main warehouse door interrupted his brooding. Caleb instinctively moved to shield the patent documents, his paranoia already heightened by the morning's discoveries. "Stay here," he told the kids, then walked through the main warehouse to the entrance. Through the cracked glass, he could see a woman in an expensive suit, the kind of outfit that cost more than his truck. She looked out of place in the industrial district, like a rose growing in a parking lot. "Mr. Monroe?" she called through the door. "My name is Victoria Reese. I represent some parties who might be interested in purchasing your property." Caleb's blood chilled. It had been less than 2 weeks since they'd discovered the workshop, and they'd been careful not to discuss it outside the warehouse walls. How could anyone already know? "I'm not interested in selling," he called back. "Perhaps we could discuss it. I think you'll find our offer quite generous." "I said I'm not interested." Through the glass, he saw her reach into her briefcase and pull out what looked like a legal document. "Mr. Monroe, I should mention that there are some irregularities with your property taxes that could create complications for your ownership. Perhaps we could help resolve those issues." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Caleb felt anger rise in his chest, the same protective fury he'd felt when Marcus had been bullied at school, when Evie had been dismissed by a teacher who didn't recognize her intelligence. "You can take your offer and stick it up your dad." Evie's voice came from behind him. She'd been listening, he realized, probably worried about the stranger's unexpected visit. The woman's eyes sharpened when she saw Evie, cataloging details with the efficiency of someone trained to gather intelligence. "Your daughter is quite lovely. High school age? It's so important for young people to have stability, don't you think?" The implied threat made Caleb's vision blur with rage. "Get away from my building. Now." "Of course. But please consider our discussion, Mr. Monroe. These sorts of situations can become quite complicated when they're not handled properly." She walked away with the confident stride of someone who always got what she wanted, eventually. Caleb watched her get into a black sedan, kind of anonymous luxury car that screamed corporate expense account, and drive away. "Who was that?" Marcus asked, appearing at Caleb's other shoulder. "Trouble," Caleb said grimly, the kind of trouble Thomas was trying to avoid. Back in the workshop, they spread out all the documents they'd found, patents, letters, research notes, and the incomplete application that could be worth more than many small countries' GDP. The pattern was becoming clear. Thomas had created something extraordinary, but he'd spent the last decades of his life running from the people who wanted to exploit it. And now those people knew where to find it. "We need help," Evie said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Someone who understands patents and legal stuff and can tell us what our rights are. And someone we can trust," Marcus added. "Because if this stuff is really worth what Uncle Thomas thought it was, there are going to be a lot of people who want to take it away from us." Caleb thought about his family, Derek with his corporate law practice, Frank with his engineering connections, his mother with her network of influential friends. Under normal circumstances, they would be the obvious people to turn to for help. But these weren't normal circumstances. The letters had made it clear that Thomas's technology attracted attention from powerful interests who weren't above using pressure, threats, and legal manipulation to get what they wanted. And Caleb's family had already made their feelings about his inheritance abundantly clear. "We need someone who's not connected to the family," he said. "Someone who won't have divided loyalties." "What about Mrs. Chen?" Evie suggested. "She used to be an engineer before she opened the restaurant. Maybe she knows someone." It was a start. Mrs. Chen had shown them kindness when they had nothing to offer in return, and her background suggested she might understand the technical implications of what they'd found. But as Caleb looked at the patent draft with its astronomical value estimate, he realized they were facing a problem much larger than finding the right lawyer. They were about to enter a world where $100 million decisions were made by people who viewed human concerns as minor inconveniences. Thomas had spent 30 years hiding from that world, protecting his work from those who would misuse it. Now that responsibility had fallen to a broke mechanic and his 2 teenage children. The patent application draft represented more than just financial opportunity. It was a test of character that would determine not just their future, but potentially the future of entire industries. As Caleb carefully returned the document to its protective sleeve, he found himself thinking about the woman in the expensive suit and her politely delivered threats. She'd underestimated him, just like his family had, just like everyone had. That might be the only advantage he had. But sometimes, in a world where power and money ruled everything, being underestimated was exactly the edge an underdog needed. The question now was whether he was brave enough and smart enough to use it. The Cold War-era correspondence that Mrs. Chen helped them decode revealed the true scope of Thomas Monroe's burden. "Your great-uncle was brilliant," she said, adjusting her reading glasses as she studied the technical documents spread across her restaurant's backroom table. "But he was also terrified. Mrs. Chen had been more than helpful, she'd been a godsend. When Caleb had approached her about finding legal advice, she'd revealed that her engineering background included a decade at Bell Labs, where she'd worked on classified telecommunications projects. She understood both the technical implications of Thomas's work and the political pressures that came with breakthrough innovations. "This letter here," she continued, pointing to a document dated 1979, "is from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They wanted to fund his research, but only for military applications." Thomas refused. The letter was polite but insistent, offering millions in research funding, with the expectation that Thomas's precision manufacturing techniques would be used to improve weapons systems. His handwritten response, carbon-copied and filed with meticulous care, was equally polite but firm. "I will not contribute to technologies designed to harm." He was a pacifist, Evie realized, reading over Mrs. Chen's shoulder. That's why he turned down all the money. "More than that," Mrs. Chen said, "he was a man with principles who understood that his technology could change the world. He wanted to make sure it changed it for the better." The correspondence painted a picture of a man under enormous pressure from multiple directions. Defense contractors wanted his technology for weapons. Civilian corporations wanted it for manufacturing dominance. Government agencies wanted it for strategic advantage. Everyone had offers, and when offers didn't work, they moved to pressure tactics. One letter from a company called Blackwater Industries in 1982 was particularly chilling. "Mr. Monroe, your continued refusal to license your technology is beginning to harm American competitiveness in critical industries. We hope you'll reconsider your position before external pressures make that decision for you." "External pressures," Marcus read aloud. "That sounds like a threat." "It was," Mrs. Chen confirmed. "I've seen this before in the defense industry. When someone develops something truly revolutionary and won't cooperate, the pressure can become intense." She pulled out another letter, this one from the patent office itself, dated 1984. "This is interesting. The government tried to classify his patents under national security provisions. If they'd succeeded, Thomas wouldn't have been able to discuss his work with anyone without security clearance." "Could they do that?" Caleb asked. "They tried, but Thomas fought it. Look at his response." Thomas's letter to the patent office was longer than his usual correspondence, and it revealed both his legal sophistication and his moral clarity. He argued that his technology had primarily civilian applications, that classification would stifle beneficial innovation, and that the national security claims were exaggerated to serve corporate interests rather than genuine defense needs. "He won," Mrs. Chen noted. "The patents remained unclassified, but it cost him years of legal battles and probably hundreds of thousands in attorney fees." The picture that emerged was of a man who had created something extraordinary, but had spent decades fighting to keep it from being misused. Every letter in his files represented another attempt by powerful interests to gain control of his work, and every response showed his determination to resist. "But why didn't he just publish it?" Evie asked. "I mean, if he wanted the technology to be used for good, why not make it public so everyone could benefit?" Mrs. Chen smiled at the question. "Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do with powerful technology is give it to everyone indiscriminately." Thomas understood that his innovations needed to go to people who would use them responsibly. "People like Dad," Marcus said with a confidence that made Caleb's chest tight with emotion. "Perhaps," Mrs. Chen said diplomatically. "But first, we need to understand exactly what you've inherited. These letters suggest the technology is even more valuable now than it was 30 years ago." She was right. As computer technology had advanced, the precision manufacturing capabilities that Thomas had pioneered had become essential to everything from smartphone production to medical devices. What had been revolutionary in 1980 was now foundational to entire industries. "We need to have the patents evaluated," Caleb said. "Find out if they're still valid, what they're worth today, and how to protect them." "I know someone," Mrs. Chen said. a patent attorney who specializes in complex intellectual property cases. He's trustworthy, and he owes me a favor." But even as they made plans to assess the technical and legal value of Thomas's work, Caleb found himself thinking about the woman in the expensive suit who had visited the warehouse. Victoria Reese, she'd called herself, representing interested parties who wanted to buy his property. It was too much of a coincidence. Less than 2 weeks after discovering the workshop, someone was already pressuring him to sell. Either they knew more than they were letting on, or they were monitoring the situation more closely than he'd realized. "Mrs. Chen," he said carefully, "when you worked at Bell Labs, did you ever encounter situations where companies tried to acquire technology through intimidation?" Her expression grew serious. "More often than I'd like to remember." "Why?" He told her about Victoria Reese's visit, the polite threats about property taxes, and the implied concerns about his children's stability. Mrs. Chen listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the implications. "They're testing you," she said when he finished, "seeing how you respond to pressure, whether you can be intimidated or bought off easily. And if I can't, then they'll escalate. Corporate intelligence, legal challenges, regulatory pressure. There are many ways to make someone's life difficult when they control something valuable." The weight of the situation settled on Caleb's shoulders like a physical burden. He'd thought inheriting the warehouse was complicated when it was just about unpaid taxes and structural repairs. Now he was facing the possibility that powerful interests might view him as an obstacle to acquiring technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "What would you do?" he asked Mrs. Chen. "If you were in my position?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying the letters spread across the table. Thomas spent 30 years running from this decision. He could have been wealthy, famous, influential. Instead, he chose to protect his work until he could find the right person to carry it forward. "But I'm not the right person," Caleb said, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at him since they'd first discovered the workshop. "I'm a failed mechanic who can't even keep a roof over his kids' heads." "Thomas didn't think so," Evie said quietly. "He could have left the warehouse to anyone, but he chose you." "Maybe he chose you because you understand what it means to be dismissed," Mrs. Chen suggested. "To have people assume you're not capable, not worthy of respect. That kind of experience teaches empathy, and empathy is essential when you're dealing with technology that could affect millions of lives." As they packed up the correspondence, Caleb found himself thinking about Thomas's final years. The man had lived like a hermit, avoiding family gatherings, working in secret, carrying the burden of his extraordinary discoveries alone. He died with his life's work hidden away, trusting that somehow, someday, the right person would find it and know what to do. That evening, back in the warehouse, Caleb sat with his children in their makeshift living space, the weight of responsibility pressing down on all of them. The Cold War-era correspondence had revealed not just the value of Thomas's work, but the moral complexity of possessing it. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Chen said," Evie murmured, breaking the contemplative silence. "About Uncle Thomas choosing you specifically. What if this isn't just an inheritance? What if it's a test?" "A test of what?" Marcus asked. "Of whether we're worthy of it, whether we'll use it the right way." Caleb looked at his daughter, 17 years old, and already wiser than many adults he knew. "What do you think the right way is?" "Not selling it to the highest bidder," she said immediately, "and not letting it disappear back into hiding. Uncle Thomas created this technology to help people. We should find a way to make sure that's what happens." It was an idealistic answer, but not a naive one. Evie understood the complexities involved, the powerful interests that would try to control or exploit Thomas's work. But she also understood something that Caleb was just beginning to grasp, that they had been given an extraordinary opportunity to make a positive difference in the world. The correspondence had shown him what Thomas had sacrificed to keep his technology out of the wrong hands. Now, it was Caleb's turn to decide what he was willing to sacrifice to ensure it ended up in the right ones. Outside the warehouse, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy traffic on distant highways, trains rumbling past on aging tracks, the sounds of people living their lives without knowing that a few blocks away, 3 people were grappling with decisions that could reshape entire industries. Tomorrow, Mrs. Chen would introduce them to her patent attorney contact. They would begin the formal process of understanding exactly what they possessed and how to protect it. But tonight, Caleb found himself thinking about Thomas Monroe, the brilliant eccentric who had chosen principle over profit, isolation over exploitation. The Cold War-era correspondence wasn't just historical documents, it was a roadmap showing the pressures they would face and the principles they would need to maintain. Thomas had shown them that it was possible to resist those pressures, but only at enormous personal cost. The question now was whether Caleb Monroe, failed mechanic and family disappointment, had the strength to follow in his great-uncle's footsteps when the stakes were higher than Thomas had ever imagined. As he drifted off to sleep on his cot in the corner of the vast warehouse, Caleb dreamed of letters and legal documents, of corporate boardrooms and government agencies, of a brilliant man who had spent 30 years protecting something precious until the right person could be trusted with it. In his dreams, that person looked a lot like himself. The prototype machine that hummed to life under Caleb's cautious hands represented 30 years of Thomas Monroe's genius, and it was worth more than some small nation's entire economies. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then immediately apologized to his children for the profanity. But the moment called for something stronger than everyday language. What he was witnessing defied everything he thought he knew about manufacturing technology. The machine occupied most of one workbench in Thomas's hidden laboratory, a complex assembly of precision components that looked like someone had crossed a Swiss watch with a spacecraft guidance system. When Caleb had first uncovered it, removing the protective tarp with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a priceless artifact, it had seemed inert, lifeless. But Mrs. Chen's patent attorney friend, David Kim, had recognized what they were looking at immediately. "This is the prototype from patent application 4/847/392, he'd said, consulting the thick folder of documents they'd assembled over the past week. If this actually works, if Thomas built a functioning version of what he described in these papers, then you're looking at technology that could revolutionize precision manufacturing across dozens of industries." Kim had been cautious at first, the kind of careful skepticism that came from 30 years of dealing with inventors who promised more than they could deliver. But as he'd studied Thomas's documentation, his professional reserve had given way to genuine excitement. "Your great-uncle wasn't just ahead of his time," he'd told Caleb. "He was ahead of our time. This control system could coordinate manufacturing processes with an accuracy that current technology still struggles to achieve." Now, watching the machine respond to the control inputs with movements measured in thousandths of inches, Caleb understood why Thomas had spent decades hiding from the world. This wasn't just an invention, it was a paradigm shift that could make entire industries obsolete while creating new ones that didn't yet exist. "How much?" Marcus asked, his voice hushed with awe as they watched the machine execute a complex sequence of operations. "I mean, if this actually works like the patents say it does, how much is it worth?" Kim had been researching that question for days, consulting with colleagues and running preliminary patent searches. His preliminary assessment had left all of them stunned. Conservative estimate, assuming the patents are valid and the technology can be licensed broadly. He paused, as if the number was too large to say casually. $200 million minimum, potentially much more if it performs as advertised. 200 million. The number hung in the air of the secret workshop like a physical presence, too large to fully comprehend. Caleb thought about his unpaid bills, his children's college funds that didn't exist, the years of struggle and disappointment that had defined his adult life. All of it could disappear with a single licensing deal. "But there's a complication," Kim continued, his tone shifting to the careful, neutral voice lawyers used when delivering bad news. "The technology is so advanced, so potentially disruptive, that licensing it commercially would draw enormous attention from competitors, government agencies, and corporate interests that might not want this level of precision manufacturing to become widely available. "What kind of attention?" Evie asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "The kind your great-uncle spent 30 years avoiding. Patent challenges, corporate espionage, regulatory pressure, potentially even national security reviews, if the wrong people decide this technology has military applications." As if summoned by their discussion of unwanted attention, Caleb's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Monroe, this is Victoria Reese. We should schedule a meeting to discuss your situation. The longer we wait, the more complicated things become. Please call at your earliest convenience." Caleb showed the message to Kim, whose expression grew grimmer as he read it. "They're escalating," he said. "The fact that they have your personal number suggests they've done significant research into your background. Corporate intelligence, probably." "Corporate intelligence," Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the words. "Companies that specialize in gathering information about targets for acquisition or pressure campaigns. They'll know your financial situation, your employment history, probably your children's school records and social media activity." The thought of strangers investigating his family made Caleb's anger rise like mercury in a thermometer. Bad enough that he'd become a target, the idea that Evie and Marcus were being scrutinized by corporate operatives was intolerable. "What do they want?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Thomas's technology, obviously. The question is whether they're planning to acquire it through purchase, legal pressure, or some combination of both." Kim pulled out his laptop and began typing rapidly. "I'm going to file provisional patent applications for everything we've documented so far. It won't provide complete protection, but it will establish legal priority and make it harder for anyone to challenge your ownership." As Kim worked, Caleb found himself studying the prototype machine with new eyes. It represented not just financial opportunity, but a responsibility that was almost overwhelming. Thomas had created something that could benefit millions of people: more efficient medical devices, better computer components, precision manufacturing that could revolutionize everything from automotive production to space exploration. But in the wrong hands, the same technology could be used to dominate markets, eliminate competitors, or create weapons systems that would make current military technology obsolete. "Dad," Evie said quietly, "what are we going to do?" It was the question that had been consuming his thoughts since they'd first discovered the workshop. The easy answer was to take whatever money they could get and walk away from the responsibility. They could pay off their debts, buy a house, send both kids to college, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. But Thomas hadn't chosen the easy answer. He'd spent 3 decades protecting his technology, waiting for the right person to inherit the burden, and somehow, improbably, he'd chosen Caleb. "We're going to honor Uncle Thomas's wishes," Caleb said, the words coming out more confidently than he felt. "We're going to find a way to make sure this technology is used to help people, not exploit them." "Even if it means fighting corporations with unlimited resources?" Marcus asked. "Even if it means that." Kim looked up from his laptop, his expression mixing admiration with concern. "You understand what you're getting into? These aren't local competitors we're talking about. These are multinational corporations with legal departments bigger than most law firms." "Thomas fought them for 30 years, Caleb said. "And he was alone. We've got each other, and we've got people like you and Mrs. Chen who understand what's at stake." As if to underscore the magnitude of their decision, the prototype machine completed its demonstration cycle with a soft chime, the sound of precision engineering operating exactly as designed. In that moment, Caleb felt the full weight of his inheritance, just the technology itself, but the moral responsibility that came with it. Victoria Reese and her interested parties would have to wait for their answer. Thomas Monroe had spent a lifetime ensuring his technology remained in the right hands, and Caleb intended to honor that legacy, no matter what it cost him. The prototype machine hummed quietly in the background, a testament to one man's genius and another man's determination to protect it. In the days to come, that determination would be tested in ways that none of them could yet imagine. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of Thomas's workshop, they had each other and the knowledge that they were fighting for something larger than themselves. It would have to be enough. Thomas Monroe's journal, hidden beneath a false bottom in his workshop desk, revealed a truth that changed everything Caleb thought he understood about his inheritance. March 15th, 1987, Evie read aloud, her voice trembling with the implications of what they'd discovered. Watched Caleb at the church today during Sarah's funeral. He stood apart from the rest of the family, not because they excluded him, but because he chose dignity over acceptance. Derek offered to pay for the service, his way of helping, I suppose, but Caleb refused. He'd rather struggle with honor than accept charity that came with judgment. The journal entries spanned decades, hundreds of pages of meticulous observations about a family Thomas had never abandoned, only avoided. Entry after entry revealed the truth. Thomas Monroe had been watching them all along, studying his relatives from the shadows, waiting for the right person to emerge. June 3rd, 1994. Marcus continued reading. Caleb's promotion to shop foreman fell through today. Frank called it typical Caleb, always falling short when it matters. But I saw what really happened. Caleb recommended his assistant Pete for the position. Instead, the man has 4 kids and a sick wife. Caleb chose someone else's need over his own advancement. The family sees failure. I see character. Caleb felt like he was reading about a stranger. The journal portrayed a man Thomas had been observing with the focused attention of a scientist studying a crucial experiment. Every family gathering, every setback, every moment when Caleb had chosen principle over profit had been noted and analyzed. "Why didn't he ever talk to me?" Caleb whispered, overwhelmed by the realization that he'd had a guardian angel he'd never known existed. The answer came several pages later, in an entry dated 2 months after Sarah's diagnosis. December 12th, 2003. Caleb mortgaged the house today to pay for Sarah's experimental treatment. The doctors give it a 15% chance of success, but he's willing to risk everything for that slim hope. Derek advised against it, financially irresponsible, he said. Helen called it throwing good money after bad, but Caleb doesn't care about financial responsibility when his wife's life is at stake. This is the kind of man who should inherit what I've built, someone who understands that some things are more important than money. The journal revealed Thomas as a man torn between his desire to help and his need to remain hidden. Time and again, he'd been tempted to reach out, to offer assistance or guidance, but he'd held back, knowing that his technology made him a target and that contact with him could bring danger to the people he cared about. He was protecting us, Evie realized, tears streaming down her face as she read about her grandfather's funeral, where Thomas had stood in the back of the church, unrecognized by his own family. All those years we thought he didn't care. He was actually watching over us. The most revealing entries came from the final years, when Thomas had grown older and the pressure from corporate interests had intensified. Page after page detailed his growing certainty that Caleb was the right choice to inherit his life's work. September 8th, 2015. Caleb lost his job at Henderson's garage. Today, 3rd layoff in 5 years. Not performance issues, never performance issues. He's too skilled, too honest for his own good. Recommends repairs customers actually need instead of the profitable ones. Refuses to overcharge elderly customers. In this economy, integrity is a luxury most employers can't afford. But it's exactly what my technology needs, someone who won't compromise their values for profit. April 20, 2018. Watched Caleb at Evie's science fair today. She won first place for her engineering project, and you could see the pride radiating from him like sunlight. Frank was there too, checking his phone, making it clear his own daughter's participation was just an obligation. Caleb may struggle financially, but he's raising children who understand the value of learning, of building, of creating rather than just consuming. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before Thomas's death. November 30th, 2023. Made my decision today. The lawyers think I'm crazy leaving everything to that Monroe boy who can't keep a job. But they don't understand what I've seen over the past 30 years. Caleb Monroe has been tested by life in ways his successful brothers never have been. He's faced poverty, loss, family disappointment, and professional failure, and through it all, he's maintained his integrity. He's exactly the kind of man who can be trusted with technology that could change the world. The others see his struggles as evidence of failure. I see them as proof of character. The workshop fell silent as they finished reading. The implications were staggering. Thomas hadn't left the warehouse to Caleb out of pity or random chance. It had been a deliberate choice based on decades of careful observation and moral evaluation. "He chose you because you're good," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not successful, not rich, not impressive to other people, just good." But the journal revealed something else, something that made Caleb's blood run cold. In the margins of the later entries, Thomas had noted increasing surveillance of his activities. Phone calls at odd hours with no one on the line, cars parked outside his apartment for days at a time, mail that had been obviously tampered with. They were watching him, Caleb realized. The same people who are pressuring us now, they knew he was planning to leave his technology to someone. The final pages of the journal contained detailed instructions for accessing safety deposit boxes at 3 different banks, each containing backup copies of patents, research notes, and most importantly, legal documents that would establish beyond question Caleb's legitimate ownership of everything Thomas had created. But there was also a warning, written in Thomas's increasingly shaky handwriting as his health had declined. "The forces that have been pressuring me for 30 years will not simply accept my decision to leave this technology to Caleb. They will try to convince him that he's not qualified, that he should sell or license the patents to responsible parties who can properly develop the technology. They will use his financial situation against him, his family's dismissive attitude, his own self-doubt. They will make him believe that holding on to this inheritance is selfish, irresponsible, even dangerous to his children. But Caleb must understand. I didn't choose him despite his struggles. I chose him because of them. The technology I've created needs someone who understands what it means to be powerless, someone who won't be corrupted by the enormous wealth and influence it could provide." "They're not just trying to buy the technology," Evie said, understanding flooding her voice. "They're trying to make Dad believe he doesn't deserve it." That's exactly what they were doing, Caleb realized. Victoria Reese's polite threats, his family's assumption that he'd made a mistake, even his own doubts about his worthiness, it was all part of a strategy that Thomas had anticipated and warned against. The journal was more than just a record of Thomas's observations. It was a roadmap for the psychological warfare that corporate interests would wage against anyone who stood between them and technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But it was also proof that Caleb Monroe, failed mechanic and family disappointment, had been specifically chosen for this responsibility by someone who had spent decades evaluating what kind of man he really was. Thomas's final words in the journal were addressed directly to his heir. "Caleb, if you're reading this, then you've discovered what I've spent my life protecting. The technology is important, but you are more important. You are the conscience this technology needs, the moral compass that will ensure it's used to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to empower rather than control. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Don't let them make you believe you're not worthy of this trust. I've been watching you for 30 years, and I know exactly who you are. That's why you're reading these words." As Caleb closed the journal, he felt a transformation taking place inside him. The self-doubt that had plagued him since childhood, the sense that everyone else was more qualified, more deserving, more capable, all fell away, replaced by a clarity of purpose he'd never experienced before. Thomas Monroe had chosen him not despite his failures, but because those failures had forged him into the kind of man who could be trusted with extraordinary power. The question now was whether he was ready to become that man. The legal documents that David Kim retrieved from Thomas's safety deposit boxes transformed everything from a family inheritance dispute into a battle for control of technology that could reshape global manufacturing. "This changes the entire game," Kim said, spreading the authenticated patents across the conference table in his downtown office. "These aren't just valid, they're bulletproof." Thomas documented everything with the precision of someone who knew he'd eventually have to defend his work in court. The past week had been a whirlwind of revelations and preparations. Victoria Reese's interested parties had revealed themselves to be a consortium of three major corporations: Meridian Industries, Techdyne Corporation, and Blackwater Manufacturing, the same companies that had been pressuring Thomas for decades. They'd made increasingly aggressive offers for the warehouse and its contents, each one wrapped in legal language that would have transferred not just the property, but all intellectual property rights. "They know exactly what you have," Kim continued. "The question is how they found out so quickly." That question had been answered when Mrs. Chen discovered listening devices planted in the restaurant's back room where they'd been meeting. Professional-grade surveillance equipment, the kind used by corporate intelligence firms with unlimited budgets and flexible ethics. "We've been compromised from the beginning," Caleb realized, the implications settling over him like a cold fog. Every conversation, every plan, every discovery, they've known about all of it. But Thomas's journal had prepared him for this possibility. One entry, dated 1992, had detailed similar surveillance tactics used against him, and his response: "They can listen to my words, but they can't read my heart. As long as my true intentions remain hidden, their intelligence is incomplete." Now, following Thomas's example, Caleb had assembled his own team of allies who understood what was at stake. Mrs. Chen had connections in the engineering community who could verify the technology's revolutionary potential. Kim's law firm specialized in intellectual property cases that involved corporate intimidation. And most importantly, his children had proven they could be trusted with secrets that powerful people would kill to possess. "The patents are worth more than we originally estimated," Kim said, consulting a thick report prepared by independent technology assessors. "Conservative licensing value is now projected at $400 million, potentially much more if the technology proves scalable to industrial applications." 400 million. The number had lost its power to shock Caleb, replaced by a deeper understanding of what that wealth represented, not just financial security, but the ability to ensure Thomas's technology was developed responsibly, with safeguards against misuse. "But there's something else," Kim continued, his expression growing grave. "The consortium has filed a legal challenge, claiming that Thomas Monroe was mentally incompetent when he created his will, and that his technology poses national security risks that require government oversight." "Mental incompetence?" Evie's voice rose with indignation. "Uncle Thomas was a genius. They're arguing that a rational person wouldn't have hidden technology this valuable, that his reclusiveness and refusal to commercialize his inventions demonstrate psychological instability. It's a classic corporate tactic. When you can't acquire something legitimately, you attack the mental state of whoever owns it." The national security angle was more troubling. If the government classified Thomas's patents under defense provisions, Caleb would lose the right to license or develop the technology independently. It would effectively transfer control to the same corporate interests that had been pursuing Thomas for 30 years. "How long do we have?" Caleb asked. "The legal challenges will take months to resolve, but they've also filed for a temporary injunction that would freeze all patent rights until the cases are decided. The hearing is scheduled for Monday, 4 days from now. 4 days to prepare for a legal battle against opponents with unlimited resources and decades of experience in manipulating the patent system. 4 days to prove that Thomas Monroe had been completely rational when he entrusted his life's work to a broke mechanic rather than established corporations. "We need character witnesses," Kim said. "People who can testify to Thomas's mental state, his reasons for hiding his technology, and most importantly, his deliberate choice of you as his heir." That evening, back in the warehouse, Caleb sat with his children in their makeshift living space, planning their defense against forces that seemed impossibly powerful. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were fighting to keep technology that could make them wealthy beyond imagination, while living in conditions that most people would consider poverty. "I keep thinking about what Uncle Thomas wrote," Evie said, holding the journal they'd been studying for days. "About how he chose you because of your struggles, not despite them. Maybe that's our defense showing the court that his decision was based on decades of careful observation, not mental illness." "But how do we prove that?" Marcus asked. "I mean, the journal is great, but couldn't they argue he was just documenting his own delusions?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen arrived at the warehouse carrying a box of documents that she'd been collecting since learning about the legal challenge. "I've been calling old colleagues," she said, unpacking files and photographs. "People who worked with Thomas in the early days, before he went into hiding. They remember him as brilliant, principled, and absolutely sane." The documents painted a picture of Thomas Monroe as a respected engineer who had made a rational choice to protect revolutionary technology from exploitation. Letters from former colleagues described his moral clarity, his technical expertise, and his growing concern about the military applications of his work. "This is Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to a photograph of a distinguished woman in a lab coat. "She worked with Thomas at Bell Labs in the 1970s before he started his independent research. She's agreed to testify about his mental state and his reasons for avoiding corporate partnerships." But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source security camera footage from the law office where Caleb had inherited the warehouse. The cameras had recorded Thomas visiting Derek's firm 6 months before his death, lucid and articulate as he discussed the details of his will. "He specifically mentioned you by name," Kim said, reviewing the footage. "Explained his reasons for choosing you, discussed his concerns about corporate pressure, and demonstrated clear understanding of the legal implications of his decision." The footage showed Thomas as Kim's assessors had found him a brilliant man making a carefully considered choice about the future of his life's work. It would be difficult for anyone to argue mental incompetence in the face of such clear evidence. But Caleb knew the legal battle was only part of the challenge they faced. The consortium had resources beyond the court system, political connections, regulatory influence, and the kind of corporate power that could make life difficult for anyone who stood in their way. "They're going to try to destroy us," he told his children that night. "Not just win the court case, but make sure we can't enjoy the victory, even if we get it." "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. "We honor Uncle Thomas's trust in us. We fight for his technology, not because we want to be rich, but because he believed we were the right people to protect it." As they prepared for the legal battle that would determine not just their financial future, but the legacy of Thomas Monroe's extraordinary work, Caleb found himself thinking about the journal entry that had changed everything. Thomas had written about watching his family for 30 years, studying their character, waiting for someone worthy of his trust to emerge. Now it was Caleb's turn to prove that trust had been well placed. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. 4 days to prepare for a battle against corporate giants who viewed Thomas's technology as their rightful property and Caleb Monroe as an obstacle to be eliminated. But they had something the corporations didn't expect, the moral clarity that came from fighting for principles rather than profit, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles were won not by the most powerful, but by the most determined. Thomas Monroe had spent 30 years protecting his technology from people who would misuse it. Now his chosen heir would discover if he had the strength to carry that burden forward, no matter what it cost him. The legal documents spread across Kim's conference table represented more than just patent rights and financial opportunity. They were Thomas's final gift to a man he'd believed capable of using extraordinary power wisely. Monday would reveal whether that belief had been justified. Thomas Monroe's final letter, discovered sealed in an envelope marked "For the Court" in his safety deposit box, was read aloud in the federal courthouse on a Monday morning that would determine the fate of technology worth nearly $500 million. To whom it may concern, Judge Patricia Martinez read, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. If this letter is being read in a legal proceeding, it means that my decision to leave my life's work to Caleb Monroe is being challenged by the same corporate interests that have pursued my technology for 3 decades. Caleb sat at the defendant's table with David Kim, watching the faces of the opposing counsel as Thomas's words filled the courtroom. The consortium's legal Temp 12 lawyers from 3 different firms had entered the hearing with the confidence of people accustomed to winning. Now their expressions showed the first hints of concern. I want to state unequivocally that I am of sound mind and clear judgment as I write this. My decision to entrust my technology to Caleb Monroe is not the product of mental illness, family sentiment, or irrational thinking. It is the result of 30 years of careful observation and moral evaluation. The letter went on to detail Thomas's reasoning with the precision of a legal brief. He described his decades of watching the family, his growing conviction that Caleb possessed the character necessary to handle revolutionary technology responsibly, and his specific concerns about corporate control of innovations that could reshape entire industries. Caleb Monroe has been tested by adversity in ways that reveal true character. I have watched him choose principle over profit, integrity over advancement, and family welfare over personal comfort. These are not the qualities of a man who can be easily corrupted or intimidated. Judge Martinez paused in her reading to look directly at Caleb. He felt the weight of Thomas's faith in him like a physical presence, strengthening his resolve for what was to come. The consortium's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Webb, who radiated expensive confidence, had built his case on the argument that Thomas's reclusiveness and refusal to commercialize valuable technology demonstrated clear mental instability. "Your Honor," Webb said when given the opportunity to respond to the letter, "with all due respect to the deceased, this document actually supports our position. A rational inventor doesn't hide revolutionary technology for 30 years while living in poverty. A sane businessman doesn't turn down hundreds of millions in legitimate offers to preserve his work for an unemployed mechanic." But Thomas had anticipated this argument. The letter continued with devastating precision. "Corporate attorneys will argue that my refusal to license my technology to established companies demonstrates irrationality. But I ask the court to consider the alternative perspective, that maintaining control of revolutionary technology until it can be entrusted to someone with appropriate moral judgment is the most rational decision possible." Kim rose to present the evidence. They'd assembled the journal entries, documenting Thomas's careful evaluation of his family members, the security footage showing his clear mental state, and testimony from colleagues who could vouch for his brilliance and moral clarity. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, now retired but still commanding, despite her 78 years, took the witness stand with the authority of someone who had spent decades evaluating scientific breakthroughs. "Thomas Monroe was one of the most rational men I ever knew," she testified. "His refusal to license his technology wasn't evidence of mental illness, it was evidence of extraordinary moral courage. He understood that his innovations could be misused, and he chose to protect them rather than profit from them." Under cross-examination, Webb tried to shake her testimony. "Dr. Hartwell, isn't it true that rational inventors typically seek to commercialize their work through established channels? Isn't hiding revolutionary technology actually harmful to scientific progress?" "That depends on who controls the technology once it's commercialized," she replied calmly. Thomas understood that some innovations are too powerful to be trusted to entities whose primary motivation is profit maximization rather than human benefit. The courtroom drama played out over 6 hours, with witnesses, expert testimony, and legal arguments that would determine not just Caleb's inheritance, but the future development of technology that could affect millions of lives. But the most powerful moment came when Kim called Caleb himself to testify about his relationship with Thomas and his understanding of the responsibility he'd inherited. "Mr. Monroe," Kim said, "did you ever meet your great-uncle Thomas before inheriting his warehouse?" "No," Caleb replied, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "But after reading his journal, I realize he knew me better than most of my family does." "What do you believe Thomas saw in you that convinced him you were the right person to inherit his technology?" Caleb looked out at the courtroom, seeing his children in the gallery, Mrs. Chen offering an encouraging smile, and the consortium's representatives taking notes on every word he spoke. "I think he saw someone who understood what it meant to be dismissed, to be considered not good enough by people who measure worth in dollars and status symbols." Thomas spent 30 years protecting technology that could make him wealthy and famous, but he chose principle over profit. He needed someone who would make the same choice. Webb's cross-examination was predictably aggressive. "Mr. Monroe, isn't it true that you can't even afford basic housing for your children? That you're living in an abandoned warehouse without proper utilities?" "That's correct. And yet you believe you're qualified to control technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Caleb felt the familiar sting of shame, the lifetime of being judged inadequate by people who measured success in material terms. But Thomas's journal had prepared him for this moment. "Mr. Webb, if having money was the primary qualification for moral decision-making, then every wealthy person would be a saint and every poor person would be corrupt. Thomas Monroe chose to live modestly while protecting technology that could have made him incredibly rich. He understood that financial success and moral character aren't the same thing. But surely you can see the irrationality of entrusting such valuable technology to someone who can't manage his own finances. I can see the rationality of entrusting it to someone who won't be corrupted by the prospect of enormous wealth. Thomas watched me for 30 years. He saw me choose my family's welfare over personal advancement, choose honesty over profitable deception, choose dignity over acceptance. Those are the qualifications he valued. Webb tried a different approach. "Mr. Monroe, are you aware that your great-uncle's technology has potential military applications that could affect national security?" "I'm aware that it has potential beneficial applications that could revolutionize medical devices, improve manufacturing efficiency, and create products that make life better for millions of people. If others want to pervert that technology for destructive purposes, that's exactly why Thomas kept it away from them." The exchange continued for another hour, with Webb trying every angle to demonstrate that Caleb was unqualified, unstable, or somehow unworthy of his inheritance. But each attack only reinforced the central point of Thomas's decision, that moral character mattered more than conventional qualifications. Judge Martinez recessed the hearing for lunch, giving both sides time to prepare their closing arguments. In the courthouse cafeteria, Caleb sat with Kim and his children, the weight of the morning's testimony settling over them like dust after a storm. "How do you think it went?" Evie asked. "Better than I expected," Kim replied. "Webb's aggressive approach is actually helping our case. Every time he attacks your father's financial situation, he reinforces Thomas's argument that conventional success isn't the right qualification for this responsibility." But will it be enough? Marcus wondered. That was the question haunting all of them. They'd presented compelling evidence of Thomas's rationality, clear documentation of his deliberate choice, and powerful testimony about his reasons. But they were fighting against opponents with unlimited resources and decades of experience in manipulating legal systems. "We've done everything we can," Caleb said. "Now we have to trust that justice means something." The afternoon session would determine whether that trust was justified. The signed patent transfer documents that Judge Martinez validated in her final ruling represented more than legal victory. They were vindication of Thomas Monroe's 30-year gamble on the character of a man the world had dismissed as a failure. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Martinez announced to the packed courtroom, This court finds that Thomas Monroe was of sound mind when he created his will and made his patent assignments. His decision to entrust his technology to Caleb Monroe was rational, deliberate, and legally binding. The consortium's legal team sat in stunned silence as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court finds that Mr. Thomas Monroe's concerns about corporate misuse of his technology were well-founded, as evidenced by the surveillance and intimidation tactics employed against his chosen heir. Caleb felt Kim's hand grip his shoulder as the reality of victory settled over him. They had won. Not just the legal battle, but validation of everything Thomas had believed about corporate power, moral character, and the responsibility that came with revolutionary technology. The temporary injunction is dissolved, Judge Martinez concluded. Caleb Monroe is hereby confirmed as the legitimate owner of all patents, technology, and intellectual property formerly belonging to Thomas Monroe. This court also orders the immediate cessation of all surveillance and intimidation activities directed at Mr. Monroe and his family. Harrison Webb rose immediately to announce his intention to appeal, but his words seemed hollow in the face of such a comprehensive defeat. The consortium had gambled everything on discrediting Thomas's mental state and Caleb's worthiness, and they had lost spectacularly. As they walked down the courthouse steps into the afternoon sunlight, Caleb felt a transformation taking place inside him. For the first time in his adult life, he had been judged worthy of something important by people who mattered. Not his family, not his former employers, but a federal judge who had evaluated all the evidence and found him deserving of Thomas's trust. "Dad," Evie said, her voice thick with emotion, "you did it. You proved Uncle Thomas was right about you." "We did it," Caleb corrected. "All of us together." But even as they celebrated their legal victory, Kim was already discussing the practical challenges ahead. The patents are secure, but developing the technology will require significant investment. And the consortium won't simply accept defeat, they'll try other approaches. Within hours of the ruling, those other approaches became apparent. Derek called with barely concealed anger in his voice. "Cal, what the hell do you think you're doing? Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into? These aren't local competitors. These are multinational corporations with government connections." "I'm doing what Uncle Thomas trusted me to do," Caleb replied calmly. Thomas was a paranoid recluse who died alone in a studio apartment. His judgment about corporate conspiracies wasn't exactly reliable. "His judgment about family character seems pretty accurate," Caleb said, ending the call before Derek could respond. The conversation with his mother was even more direct. "You're being selfish," Helen Monroe declared when she arrived at the warehouse that evening, her expression mixing disappointment with something approaching fear. "This technology belongs to the family, not just you. Thomas left it to me specifically, Mom, not the family. Because he was mentally ill, any rational person would have involved the whole family in something this valuable. Or maybe he knew the whole family well enough to understand who could be trusted with it." The words hung in the air between them, carrying 30 years of accumulated judgment and disappointment. Helen Monroe had spent decades viewing her youngest son as the family failure, and nothing, not even his legal vindication, would change that perception overnight. "You'll regret this," she said as she left. "When those corporate lawyers come after you with everything they have, don't expect your family to bail you out." But Caleb no longer needed his family's approval or protection. Thomas's journal had shown him that he'd been evaluated by someone who understood his true character, and that evaluation had resulted in the most important inheritance of his life, not just technology worth hundreds of millions, but the knowledge that someone had believed in him when no one else would. The signed patent transfer documents that Judge Martinez had validated represented the legal foundation of that inheritance. But the real transfer had happened decades earlier, when Thomas Monroe had made his quiet decision to trust a struggling mechanic with the most important work of his life. That night, in the warehouse that had become their unlikely home, Caleb sat with his children planning their future with resources they could barely comprehend. The technology they'd inherited could indeed be worth hundreds of millions in licensing fees, but more importantly, it could be developed responsibly to benefit millions of people. "What do we do first?" Marcus asked. "We honor Uncle Thomas's wishes," Caleb replied. "We find partners who share his values, people who understand that some things are more important than maximum profit." The consortium would continue their attempts to acquire or control the technology through other means: corporate espionage, regulatory pressure, market manipulation. But they would be fighting against something they had never encountered before, a man who had been chosen specifically for his ability to resist exactly those pressures. As Caleb examined the signed patent transfer documents by lamplight, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months earlier, he had been a failed mechanic facing eviction, dismissed by his family and ignored by the world. Now, he was the guardian of technology that could reshape multiple industries, with the legal authority and moral mandate to ensure it was used wisely. The transformation wasn't just in his circumstances, it was in his understanding of his own worth. Thomas Monroe had seen something in him that no one else had recognized, including himself. The federal court had validated that judgment, but more importantly, Caleb had finally validated it for himself. The signed patent documents represented more than ownership. They were proof that sometimes the most important battles were won not by the most powerful, but by the most principled. Thomas Monroe had spent 30 years protecting his technology from people who would exploit it, and now his chosen heir would spend whatever time necessary ensuring it was used to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to empower rather than control. The warehouse around them no longer felt like a shelter of last resort. It felt like the headquarters of something important, a place where revolutionary technology would be developed by people who understood its moral implications. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as corporate interests regrouped and searched for alternative strategies to acquire what they viewed as rightfully theirs. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of Thomas's workshop, they had each other and the knowledge that they had been entrusted with something extraordinary. The signed patent transfer documents lay spread across the workbench, legal proof of an inheritance that went far beyond money or technology. They represented Thomas Monroe's faith in human nature, his belief that moral character could triumph over corporate power, and his conviction that sometimes the best person to guard revolutionary technology was someone the world had dismissed as ordinary. Caleb Monroe was no longer ordinary. He was the inheritor of genius, the guardian of innovation, and the proof that Thomas Monroe's 30-year gamble on character over credentials had been the wisest decision of a very wise man's life. The new family portrait that hung in the conference room of Monroe Technologies showed 3 people who had been transformed by their journey from desperation to dignity, from family disappointment to guardians of revolutionary innovation. 2 years had passed since the federal court victory that secured Caleb's inheritance. The warehouse had been converted into offices and laboratories where Thomas's technology was being developed by a carefully selected team of engineers and ethicists who shared his vision of responsible innovation. The medical applications alone are exceeding all projections. Dr. Sarah Kim reported during the monthly board meeting. The precision surgical devices we've licensed to Johns Hopkins are performing procedures that were impossible just 18 months ago. Caleb nodded, studying the quarterly reports spread across the polished conference table. Monroe Technologies had become profitable faster than anyone had predicted, with licensing fees from carefully vetted partners generating enough revenue to fund expanded research while providing security for his family. But the true measure of success wasn't in the financial statements, it was in the knowledge that Thomas's technology was being used exactly as he had intended. Medical devices that could operate at the cellular level, manufacturing processes that reduced waste while improving quality, precision instruments that made previously impossible research achievable. "Any word from the consortium?" asked David Kim, who had become not just their attorney, but the company's general counsel. "Radio silence for the past 6 months," Caleb replied. I think they've finally accepted that we're not selling. The consortium's attempts to acquire Thomas's technology had continued long after their legal defeat, but each strategy had failed against Caleb's determination to honor his great-uncle's wishes. Corporate espionage had been thwarted by security measures that Thomas himself had designed. Regulatory pressure had been deflected by the demonstrable benefits of the technology's responsible development. Market manipulation had proved ineffective against partners who shared Monroe Technology's ethical commitment. Eventually, even multinational corporations had to acknowledge that some things couldn't be bought, stolen, or intimidated away from people with sufficient moral conviction. The university partnerships are particularly encouraging, Dr. Kim continued. MIT and Caltech are both reporting breakthrough research enabled by our precision manufacturing systems. That had been one of Caleb's proudest decisions, providing Thomas's technology to academic researchers at cost, ensuring that brilliant minds without corporate funding could still access the tools they needed for groundbreaking work. Uncle Thomas would have loved that, Evie said, looking up from the engineering schematics she'd been studying. Now 19 and a sophomore at MIT studying mechanical engineering, she spent her summers working at Monroe Technologies, learning the practical applications of the theoretical knowledge she was acquiring. He did love it, Marcus added. I found another journal entry yesterday that talks about his dream of seeing his technology used in universities. At 16, Marcus had developed an intuitive understanding of Thomas's work that surprised even the professional engineers on their team. The discovery of additional journals had been one of many surprises over the past 2 years. Thomas had hidden documentation throughout the warehouse in false walls, sealed containers, even embedded in the concrete foundation. Each cache revealed new aspects of his work and his personality, painting an increasingly complete picture of a man who had been far more optimistic about human nature than his reclusiveness had suggested. He always believed the technology would eventually reach the right people, Caleb said, thinking about the letter Thomas had left, specifically for this moment, the 2-year anniversary of their court victory. That letter, which they'd discovered in a time-locked safe programmed to open on this exact date, had contained Thomas's final words about his decision to entrust his life's work to a family member everyone else had written off. If you're reading this, Caleb, then you've succeeded where I never could. You found a way to share this technology while keeping it safe from those who would misuse it. You've proven that moral character is indeed the most important qualification for handling revolutionary innovation. I watched you for 30 years, and I was never wrong about your worth. I hope you're no longer wrong about it either. The transformation in Caleb's relationship with his extended family had been perhaps the most surprising development of all. Derek, initially hostile about his brother's refusal to share the inheritance, had gradually come to respect the principled way Caleb was managing Thomas's legacy. Frank, whose engineering background helped him understand the technology's true significance, had become an unexpected ally in navigating corporate pressures. Even Helen Monroe had eventually acknowledged that her youngest son had proven himself worthy of responsibilities she'd never imagined he could handle. You know what I think about when I look at that portrait? Evie asked, gesturing toward the photograph that had replaced the old family pictures from their days of struggle. What's that, sweetheart? I think about how Uncle Thomas saw who we really were before we saw it ourselves. He knew Dad was extraordinary when everyone else thought he was ordinary. He knew we could handle this responsibility when we didn't even know it existed. The portrait showed the 3 of them standing in front of Thomas's restored workshop, which had been preserved exactly as they'd found it, a monument to the patient genius who had changed their lives forever. But more than that, it showed 3 people who had discovered their own worth through the eyes of someone who had taken the time to really see them. Monroe Technologies had grown beyond anything Caleb had imagined when he'd first inherited a crumbling warehouse that his family had mocked as worthless. They now employed 47 people, held licensing agreements with 12 major corporations, and had established research partnerships with universities on 3 continents. But the company's mission statement, framed on the wall beside Thomas's portrait, remained unchanged from the day they'd incorporated. To develop revolutionary technology responsibly, ensuring that innovation serves humanity rather than controlling it. "We've got the Stanford proposal to review," Dr. Kim said, consulting her agenda. "They want to use our precision systems for brain surgery research." "Approved," Caleb said without hesitation. "That's exactly the kind of work Uncle Thomas envisioned." As the meeting concluded and his team dispersed to their various projects, Caleb found himself alone in the conference room, studying the family portrait that had become a symbol of transformation. The three people in that photograph bore little resemblance to the desperate family who had moved into an abandoned warehouse with nothing but hope and determination. But they were still the same people Thomas Monroe had chosen to inherit his legacy, still guided by the same values that had attracted his attention during 30 years of careful observation. The technology they'd inherited was indeed worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but its true value lay in what it represented. Proof that moral character could triumph over corporate power, that principled decisions could prevail over profitable ones, and that sometimes the most important inheritance wasn't money or property, but faith in human goodness. As Caleb turned off the conference room lights and walked through the bustling workshops where Thomas's inventions were being turned into tools for healing and discovery, he thought about the letter that had started it all, Thomas's final message about watching him for 30 years and seeing something worth believing in. That faith had been vindicated in ways neither of them could have imagined. The family failure had become the guardian of revolutionary technology. The warehouse that everyone had mocked as worthless had become the headquarters of responsible innovation. The man who couldn't afford rent had become the steward of patents worth more than some country's gross domestic product. But most importantly, the children who had grown up thinking their father was a disappointment had learned that true worth wasn't measured in conventional success, but in the quiet virtues that revealed themselves during times of struggle and testing. The new family portrait captured all of that transformation in a single image. Three people who had discovered their own extraordinary worth through the eyes of a brilliant man who had taken the time to really see them. Thomas Monroe's greatest invention hadn't been his revolutionary technology. It had been his faith in the moral potential of a family the world had dismissed, and his patient willingness to wait 30 years for that potential to be tested and proven. As Caleb locked the building and walked to his car, no longer a battered pickup truck, but still modest by the standards of his newfound wealth, he smiled at the thought of Thomas watching over them from whatever realm brilliant inventors inhabited after their earthly work was done. He'd kept his promise to use the technology wisely. He'd honored the trust placed in him by a man who had seen his worth when no one else would. And most importantly, he'd proven that sometimes the most important victories were won not by the most powerful, but by the most principled. The family portrait in the conference room would hang there for years to come, a reminder that extraordinary things could happen when extraordinary faith was placed in ordinary people who possessed the most extraordinary quality of a unshakable moral character. Thomas Monroe had spent 30 years protecting his technology until the right person could be found to inherit it. That person had been worth the wait.